For Miller, as for William Faulkner's Gavin Stevens, the past is not dead. It's not even the past. There were, though, also those in the theatre who showed a disdain for the past, particularly in the 1960s and 70s, the age of off-Broadway and off-Broadway, and a determined experimentalism. The past, Miller lamented, went out of the theatre. No more masterpieces, declared Antonin Artaud, an inspiration for many off-Broadway groups who rejected earlier dramatic models, seeking to construct their experiments on a burned-over land. The past was invoked by them at the level of myth, but otherwise it was the presentness of theatre that compelled that and a dedication to experimentalism in which they found Miller lacking and irrelevant. From All My Sons onwards, critics had identified him as a resolute realist, to some a natural expression of his left-wing views. In the 1950s, after all, the CIA was busy subsidizing abstract expressionism as the American challenge to socialist realism, part of the culture wars. And the ideological criticism of Miller's plays remained remarkably persistent, hence those hostile obituaries, which are reaching back to the left-wing nature of Arthur Miller and the Marxism of Arthur. He hadn't been that for decades. But the dismissal of him as an incorrigible realist, a kind of leftover playwright whose works belonged in a thrift store, evidence of outmoded fashions, was in part a result of ignorance of his work. For many years, I could have made good money by betting Americans that they couldn't name a single play by Miller written after 1968. I might still be able to make a buck or two, knowing that few were aware of such works because they'd had such abbreviated runs or failed to make it into New York, where reviewers might give them prominence. Nor were these later plays taught in academe, his plays apparently not lending themselves to structuralists, post-structuralists, postmodernists, deconstructionists, feminists, post-feminists, transnationalists. The study of American drama itself always having been marginalized. Robert Brustein famously published an article entitled "Why American Drama is Not Literature." One woman at an Ivy League college, who I know, on saying that she wanted to write her dissertation on Miller, was told she would be betraying her intelligence and her gender. One of Miller's family explained to me what it was like. Very often reviews were bad and I dreaded them. I grew up with a father who was failing all the time. Every time he put something up, people knocked it down. He had doubts about himself as a writer. He was working so hard and they would just brush it away. The litany of Miller's failed American productions is as depressing as it was consistent. After the Fall ran for 59 performances. Incident at Vichy, 99. Creation of the World and Other Business, 20. Bear in mind there are about 8 performances a week, 20. The Archbishop's Ceiling ran a month, which means 32 performances. Never made it to New York. The American Clock ran for 20 performances. Broken Glass, 73, losing 700,000 of the 800,000 invested in it. Resurrection Blues and Finishing the Picture ran for a month each and never made it to New York. Others like 2 by AM, renamed Two-Way Mirror, and Mr. Peter's Connections never made it beyond off-Broadway. As a result, critics and readers were unaware of the metaphysical conundrums at the heart of the Archbishop's Ceiling, the vaudeville of the American Clock, the colliding styles of Ride Down Mount Morgan, in which actions are replayed and fantasized. They failed to register the tone poem, which is Elegy for a Lady, the disintegrating selves at the heart of some kind of love story, and I think some of you are sitting there thinking, no, I couldn't have named those either, so I would have got some money from you. The satirical fable that is Resurrection Blues. In other words, his post-1968 plays were largely ignored or dismissed. In fact, Miller had been committed to experiment from his early versed drama for radio, Thunder from the Hills, about which critics knew nothing. I need to say that again. He wrote a verse drama for radio in America. And indeed, he wrote about 30 radio plays. That's where he made his money at first, before he ever made it in the theatre. And although he despised quite a lot of those plays, there were 1 or 2 of them that were really good, including this one, which starred Orson Welles. The fable that was the man who had all the luck. His first mainstream play closed after 4 performances. and wasn't seen again by Americans until it was published by an English publisher and revived in England by the Bristol Old Vic, a production which transferred to London. In other words, Arthur Miller has been thoroughly misread. The British playwright Peter Nichols once remarked of Broadway audiences that they were severely under-rehearsed. That is, they got no point of reference, having never seen Chekhov or Ibsen or Strindberg. Much the same could be said of Miller's works. Those who pigeonholed him as a realist did so because they had seen none of the plays which failed to conform to that description. Miller was also, of course, frequently out of tune in the grand symphony of America. He often wrote against the American grain, although you could argue that is the American grain. Though his script for a film supposedly designed to celebrate the American soldier in the Second World War was never used, his account of researching it, published under the title Situation Normal in 1944, turned out to be not a celebration but an attack on American values in the middle of the war. The normal situation in America's cities, he said in this book that was supposed to celebrate the fighting man and American democracy, was that people were divided along lines of class and religion, with rich and poor, white and black, Jew and Gentile. The individual, he said, was engaged in what he called the stale, deadly competition with his fellow man for rewards unconnected to his human needs. And this was Miller, the Marxist, because, of course, there was nothing the American fighting man wanted more than to go back to the world that he was describing there. Fighting man longed for the capitalist way that Miller seemed to abhor. At the same time, and again with America at war, he wrote a novel, never published, that was as direct an attack on American racism as you will have read, outside of Richard Wright's Native Son, a book which he deeply admired, incidentally. In 1945, he published a novel about anti-Semitism, written during the war. But that anti-Semitism wasn't in Europe. It was an attack on anti-Semitism in America, and specifically in New York, where it was published. His first great play, All My Sons, again written during the war, though produced after it, was about a war profiteer. Death of a Salesman, written on the verge of the greatest boom in American history, was an attack on a version of the American dream, just when people wanted, more than anything, to reclaim the American dream as they emerged from war. In 1952, when free speech was under threat, he staged his version of Ibsen's An Enemy of the People, and did so at the behest of two actors who had just been blacklisted. And he followed it with The Crucible, which suggested that America was reverting to the days of witch hunting, and as if to prove the thesis, the actress playing Abigail was subsequently blacklisted. The play had an abbreviated run. Critics attacked him. He was, it seemed, un-American in other ways than that proposed by the House Committee on Un-American Activities. Unless you believe American attacks on him came only with The Crucible, All My Sons was banned from production on US bases in Europe as an attack on capitalism. The New York Journal American described it as a pro-red play. New Leader magazine said that to send it abroad would be to play into the hands of America's enemies. An FBI informant got hold of the script of the film and sent a report to J. Edgar Hoover labelling it anti-family and anti-capitalist. The road version of Death of a Salesman was picketed by the American Legion. Doesn't take much to get them to picket anything, but the studio which made the film famously also made a 20-minute film to be distributed with it, saying how wonderful the life of a salesman was. Nor did attacks only come from the right. There were those on the left who became Trotskyites and who saw Miller as a Stalinist, and their reviews reflected this. Eleanor Clark, who was actually married to one of Trotsky's secretaries, dismissed Death of a Salesman as the product of a fellow traveller, a play which attacked our particular form of money economy. This is Death of a Salesman she's talking of. And when Miller made the mistake of attending a peace conference at the Waldorf Astoria in 1949, organised by what was patently a Communist Front organisation, you only needed the word peace in it to know that it was the communists who were actually organising it, he drew down the fire of what came to be called the non-communist left, his photograph duly being published by Life magazine as a subversive.